That's it. I'm convinced about 3D printing, and it's not something that's going to happen, it's something that has already happened, and it's going to happen more. 3D printing is the now, not the future. You will have seen it on YouTube, on Reddit, on Facebook. There's a big community following 3D printing and getting involved. 3D printing is already having a big impact in wargaming, whether you like it or not. And we can see this even more with Privateer Press and the War Machine announcement recently. So let me tell you about my 3D printing journey and why, weirdly, even though it was awkward, it actually has me more convinced. So I started off about 5 years ago with an FDM printer. You know, the ones with the big frames that look like they belong in like a workshop rather than somebody's house. But it was noisy, making noises like I'll stop that, don't worry. And because it was very useful for printing larger things, it took a long time for anything to print, really. If you were printing a building or something like that, it would take many hours, upwards of like 10 hours sometimes, which meant for me, I could only really print at the weekends. And even with those printers, 3D printing was still a hobby. You still had to level the bed, make sure you had the right temperatures for your resin and so on and so forth. And even if you got all the settings nailed, you were unlikely really to be printing like Warhammer miniatures or something like that, because the printed lines would pretty much ruin it. But it was very good for large pieces or even things like tanks, for example. If you had a bigger piece, that meant you could probably more easily fill in the lines with either filler or resin or something like that. Now, I haven't tried an FDM printer in quite a long time. I'm sure they're actually a little bit better now, and probably the lines are a lot less noticeable, right? But I'm guessing you still use it for the big bits, because otherwise you would use a resin 3D printer. And the resin 3D printer was really the true revolution here. These are generally sort of small, compact boxes, and I personally bought one maybe 2 or 3 years ago. My printer is the Elegoo Mars Pro. One I specifically bought because I was trying to reduce smell, and that was one of the ones that were recommended at the time for that. And to be fair, you see people posting online in Facebook, Reddit or YouTube their models, and the models look really good. They look very detailed, very crisp, pretty much almost GW quality, but maybe not quite, but near enough. However, with the resin 3D printer, there are still generally sort of issues that you have to overcome. You still have to level the bed, except you're not leveling the bed, you're sort of leveling the plate. Resin is smelly and you have to handle it with care. You need to wear a mask and just general things like that. You have to make sure you look after the tray, you have to look after the screen, and even if you get your printer working, you pretty much have to acquire the 3D models somewhere, the STL files generally. Now you can try and find free ones, but then it's a little bit more inconsistent with the kind of quality you're going to get. They're probably not pre-supported, etc. Or you basically subscribe to somebody's Patreon and go that route, and then maybe use the code to buy some discounted models. And they're often pre-supported, which makes life a bit easier. And well, when I got my printer, I tried resin 3D printing as you would expect, otherwise why would you buy it? I bought some eco-friendly resin, which was apparently going to smell a little bit less, and it was pretty much mostly okay, apart from the fact I could not get a print that was 100% perfect. Every time something would go wrong, maybe a slight warp here, an item not fully completing there, whatever it was, I just couldn't get a perfect model. But I never bought any of the pre-supported stuff. I was just sort of finding free stuff, and I was like, oh, I'll come back to it at some point. We also had a baby in the meantime in 2020. I thought, hey, let's just not take any chances and we'll not have any 3D printing with resin going on in the house. Now the kid's a little bit older, I can close my door a little bit more and keep her out and all that kind of stuff, right? But recently I talked about in a video if I should make an army before Warhammer the Old World comes out, and I spoke about how I would maybe 3D print one and how I would maybe buy one. Armies that I weren't really that bothered about, because I know when Games Workshop release something I'm going to want it. So I was like, what if I pick an army I'm not really that bothered about, but it'd be nice to have? And one of the armies that came to mind was Lizard Men. Now One Page Rules do a army called, I think it's like Sovereigns or something like that, I'm not 100% sure how you say it, and they basically give you one free model of each type to try out your printer and to see if you like them, I think, probably. So I downloaded the free models and started to print, and lo and behold, I was still not getting good results. To be fair, I hadn't really changed anything, so I don't know what I was expecting. I'd bought the same kind of resin again because I believe it expires, but every time I would print, I would get failures, and I was like, well, this is not going well. I tweaked the settings, the cure times, I re-leveled the bed, and so on and so forth, and nothing seemed to work. And then I was like, okay, well, maybe it's time to actually try some normal resin instead of the eco stuff. And weirdly, for me, that has been the thing that has worked. I put all the settings back to default, and since then I've been getting mostly good prints. I'm probably at a 95% print success rate, which I will take. That's better than a like 0, so I'm happy enough with that. I've now printed maybe 20 models and maybe 1 or 2 maybe have broke. I'm not sure why, I'm not going to stress about it, it's mostly working. And basically that was it. Things are now working for me. My army's literally printing right now. And when you get a 3D printer in that sweet spot, the quality of the models is pretty great. My printer's sort of relatively relatively old now, and the quality that I'm getting pretty damn good. Now, one thing I'm not necessarily a huge fan of is the cost of STLs, but there's sort of ways of working around that, like the actual cost of the models themselves. Now, I'm not saying that these designers shouldn't be paid for the work, of course they should, but if the cost of the STLs were so expensive, you then have to question whether or not it's worth having Games Workshop or another company just sell it to you. Generally, the best way of getting the models is to sign up for the Patreons, but then they won't give you the stuff because you've signed up for the Patreon. You then have to go and buy it, but you're buying it with an insane discount, so it's generally worth to sign up to Patreon and then buy the stuff, and if you like the stuff, maybe keep your Patreon or even cancel it, right? Obviously, you should support whoever you want to support. I'm not trying to say don't, but I bought the Sovereigns Pack 1 and I'm pretty set there, and I think this really sums up 3D printing and why people think it's not the future in a sense. Quite frankly, it's a massive pain in the backside, especially at first with the failures and the issues that you can get. Like, I'm pretty sure I tried to clean my resin vat with some isopropanol thinking, well, once I've wiped out most of the resin, that'll be how you clean it. What actually happened is that I completely misted up my tray. Mistakes, you live and learn. The normal resin does smell a little bit more than the eco resin, but not to a point where it's like really bothering me. But overall, just the general frustration in getting everything right can be a bit of a pain if you're not used to that. It's like a hobby, it's something you've got to learn and you've got to master itself, and I'm probably far away from mastering it, but now that I've got it mostly right, it's great. I'm getting very cheap models in a way, almost as many as I can make. Once you've got the STL files and the resin, it's very cheap per model. If me and my friends had one of these when we were playing like Warhammer Fantasy back in the day, we probably wouldn't have bought GW stuff. We would have just printed our armies and been happy. We weren't going to events, we were just playing amongst ourselves. And we see a lot of talk about 3D printing being the future. I don't think it's the future, I think it's the now. I just think some people haven't realized that. Not only is a lot of the YouTube wargaming community getting involved in 3D printing, there's very similarly sized large communities on Reddit, on Facebook, and on Patreons. It's pretty damn huge and sizable. We have whole communities getting involved. All the while, Games Workshop don't seem to acknowledge its existence, but people are printing and playing with armies that haven't had any money channeled to Games Workshop, and that might end up being a problem for them. And now we're starting to see traditional wargaming companies get involved. Privateer Press, as I mentioned at the start, have recently announced that some of their War Machine models are going to be 3D printed going forward. I actually think it's all of their War Machine models going forward, and they're actually doing some really cool stuff with parts that are going to come in multiple parts that'll have places for magnets. Sounds really cool, but there were unfortunately some issues when they announced this. They are not going to sell you the files, they're actually going to sell you models that have been 3D printed. There was unfortunately some controversy about the quality of the models. Apparently some of them had layer lines, some of the resin may have been uncured. Some of that was debunked and I don't really know the whole details, I wasn't necessarily following it, but it's unfortunate for them and 3D printing as a whole, I think. But the point is, the technology is obviously already here. It's already been here for a little while and it is impacting wargaming whether you like it or not. I do think some people are just putting their fingers in their ears, putting their heads in the sand and pretending it's not a thing. They see Games Workshop profits pretty much breaking records year on year, and I think they're hoping that the gravy train doesn't run dry. But I can't see a world where 3D printing doesn't get easier and better and becomes a real challenge and a real problem for Games Workshop. I personally believe that Games Workshop aren't acting until they feel like they have to act, because they know when they do, it's probably going to cost them at the bottom line. And the longer that they can not 3D print or have anything related to that, the more they can milk the customers who are buying from them. So Games Workshop are playing it cool right now. But I think it would be crazy to say and crazy to believe that 3D printing is not costing Games Workshop some money right now. It obviously is. If 3D printing wasn't a thing, for example, I probably would have bought some Wizard Men from Games Workshop, but I did not. That's just one example. I imagine there's quite a few people doing the same thing. But I don't want you to watch this video and think, oh, I must get into 3D printing. There is no requirement to do so, and hopefully there never will be if it's something you don't want to do. It's smelly, it's awkward, it can be mega frustrating. I came very, very close to giving up, but if eventually you make 3D printing as easy as it is to 2D print just on normal paper, then man, things will change at a rapid rate. So 3D printing is here, it'll get bigger, it'll get better, and the implications are going to be seismic. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have a most beautiful day. Like and subscribe. Goodbye.